most people's. I have been in the presence of the dead at every hour of the day and night. I have driven death calls on mountain roads at 3 in the morning in winter. I have worked alone in preparation rooms at hours when the rest of the building was empty and the county outside was completely quiet. None of that has ever frightened me. I made peace with the proximity of death young, and I have never needed to revisit that peace. I say all of this because I want you to understand the baseline from which I am describing what frightened me. What frightened me was not death. It was not the dark. It was not the isolation of being alone in a rural county in eastern Kentucky at late hours. I'm accustomed to all of those things, and none of them have ever produced in me the specific physical response that I'm about to describe. What produced that response was something I encountered on a death call in the fall of 3 years ago on a road in the upper end of Breathitt County that I'd driven dozens of times in the course of my work. The call came at 11:40 at night, which is not unusual. People die at all hours, and the families call when they call, and I go when I go. The deceased was an elderly man who had passed at home under hospice care, which meant there was no law enforcement involvement and no complications. Just a family who needed their person taken care of, in a mortuary vehicle making a late-night run up into the hills. The property was on a road I knew, a county road that wound up along a creek drainage for about 4 miles before reaching a cluster of properties at the head of the hollow. I had been to at least 2 of those properties on previous calls over the years. I drove my removal vehicle, which is a converted cargo van with the appropriate equipment, up the county road in the dark. The road follows the creek closely in places, the shoulder dropping off to the creek bank on one side and rising to wooded hillside on the other. It is a narrow road, and I drove it at the appropriate pace, which is slow. I was about 2.5 miles up the road, just past a concrete culvert crossing that I recognized as a landmark, when my headlights showed me something on the road ahead. I want to describe it as plainly as I can, because plain is how I have always approached my work, and plain is the right approach here. On the left side of the road, between the road surface and the base of the wooded hillside, which at that particular point was a margin of maybe 8 feet, there was a figure, and it was standing in that margin with its back to the road, facing the hillside, and it was the posture of it that stopped my foot on the accelerator before my brain had consciously processed what I was looking at. The posture was wrong. I have been around the human body in every configuration that death and preparation involve, and I have a comprehensive physical understanding of how the human body is structured and how it holds itself and how it moves and what it looks like when those things are not right. The figure in the margin of the road was standing with a posture that was not right. The spine was curved in a direction that a living spine does not curve, bowed outward rather than inward, the head dropping forward and below the line of the shoulders in a way that would require the neck to flex at an angle that the cervical spine does not achieve in life. The arms were held out and down at an angle from the body that put the hands somewhere near the knees, but with the elbows pointing backward rather than forward. It was standing still. It was facing the hillside with that impossible posture, and it was standing still, and it had its back to me. I stopped the van about 30 feet from it. I sat with the engine running and the headlights on, and I looked at the figure in my headlights, and the figure stood with its back to me and did not move. I have made a professional habit of thinking clearly under pressure, and I applied that habit. I considered my options. I could continue past it, giving it as much clearance as the narrow road allowed. I could reverse back down to the county road and call for assistance. I could wait and see if it moved on its own. And I could get out of the vehicle, which I was not going to do. I was in the process of deciding between the first and second options when the figure turned around. It turned to face me, and it did so in a way that I'm going to describe as mechanically as I can. The turn was not a normal rotation of the body. The head moved first, rotating to face my headlights, while the body remained facing the hillside, and the head rotation exceeded the range of motion that the human cervical spine permits. It kept rotating past the point where a normal neck stops, continuing the rotation until the face was fully toward me, while the body was still facing away. Then the body followed, rotating to bring itself into alignment with the head. And the body rotation had the same quality, that wrong mechanical quality, of something that moves and ranges that living tissue does not permit. The face was in my headlights, and I could see it, and I'm not going to describe it in detail, because there are some things that have an appropriate level of specificity, and this is not one of them. What I will say is that the face was the part that ended my deliberation about options. I put the van in reverse, and I backed down that road for the better part of a quarter mile before I found a wide point in the shoulder where I could turn around, and I drove back to the county road, and I called the family from the county road, and I told them I had encountered an obstacle on the road and needed to take a different approach route. I drove the long way around, which added about 20 minutes to the call, and I collected the deceased, and I did my job. I have not driven that specific stretch of the road since that night. The county road has an alternate approach to the properties at the head of the hollow, a longer route that adds time but that does not pass the stretch where the margin is 8 feet wide between the road and the base of the wooded hillside. I take the alternate route every time I have a call up that hollow, and I will continue to take it for as long as I'm doing this work. I told one person about what I saw, a colleague of mine who has been in funeral services in the adjacent county for about 20 years, a man named Floyd Stacy, who is as practical and clear-eyed as anyone in this profession is required to be. Floyd listened to the whole account, and then he was quiet for a moment, and then he said that he had heard something from a colleague of his own years before about a road in Breathitt County where something had been seen that did not move like a person. He did not know which road, and he did not have details. He just said he had heard that and had not known what to do with it, and now he supposed he knew a little more of it. I do not know what I saw on that road. I have a comprehensive knowledge of what a human body looks like and how it moves and what happens to those things when the body is no longer alive. And what I saw on that road was not consistent with any of that knowledge. It moved in ranges that living tissue does not permit, and it moved in ranges that dead tissue does not permit either, because dead tissue does not move at all. And what I saw moved. It turned. It faced me. That is what I have. 26 years of professional experience with the dead, and one night on a road in Breathitt County that sits outside everything that experience prepared me for. I am at peace with my work. I'm at peace with death. I'm not entirely at peace with what I saw in my headlights on that road, and I suspect I'm not going to be. And I have made the professional decision to accept that and move forward, which is exactly what my work has always required of me. Story 2. People who do what I do for a living develop a specific relationship with old houses that most people do not have. Not the romantic relationship that people have when they see a farmhouse with good bones. And imagine what it could be with some work. The practical relationship. The relationship that comes from crawling under the floors and into the walls and up into the attics of buildings that have been standing for 100 years or more, and understanding in physical terms what that much time does to a structure. My name is Wendell Bray, and I am 52 years old, and I have been restoring old farmhouses and rural structures in Western North Carolina for going on 25 years. This is what I do. I find properties that have value in their bones and their history, and I assess them and restore them, sometimes for clients and sometimes on speculation. I have worked on buildings from the Civil War era. I have worked on structures that predate indoor plumbing and electric lighting. I know what old buildings feel like from the inside, and I know the difference between the various ways a building feels wrong and what each of those kinds of wrongness means in practical terms. I want to be specific about that because it matters for what I am about to describe. There are buildings that feel wrong because they are structurally unsound, and your body registers the unsoundness before your eyes identify the specific problem. There are buildings that feel wrong because of moisture problems or air quality issues or inadequate ventilation. There are buildings that feel wrong because they have been closed for a long time, and the air inside them has a specific quality that takes a few hours of ventilation to clear. I know all of these kinds of wrong, and I can identify them. The Callaway property in Yancey County felt wrong in none of those ways. It felt wrong in a way I did not have a category for, and have not found a category for in the 3 years since I first walked into it. The Callaway property is an 1880s farmhouse on about 12 acres in a hollow in Yancey County that I was contracted to assess and restore by a family that had inherited it and wanted to eventually use it as a vacation rental. The property had been unoccupied for approximately 15 years, since the last family member who lived there had gone into a care facility. It was in rough shape externally, but structurally sound, which is the important thing with buildings of that age. The bones were good. The problems were the kind that time and deferred maintenance create: roof, windows, systems, the usual package. I made 3 assessment visits before I began the actual restoration work. The first 2 visits were in daylight, and they were straightforward. I went through the building systematically, identified the scope of work, documented everything, put together my restoration plan. Normal professional process. The third visit was in the late afternoon and extended into the early evening because I needed to check some of the electrical routing and the basement drainage situation, both of which were easier to assess in certain light conditions. By the time I finished in the basement, it was past 7, and the light was going outside. The Callaway farmhouse has a main staircase in the central hall and a secondary staircase at the back of the house that connects the kitchen area to the upper hall. The secondary staircase is narrow, as back staircases in farmhouses of that era typically are, and it has a door at both the top and the bottom. I had been through both doors on my prior visits and had left both of them open, as I typically do when I am working through a building, to keep air moving and to maintain my own sense of the space. When I came up from the basement, the door at the bottom of the back staircase was closed. I had left it open. There was no wind that evening significant enough to move a door of that weight on those hinges, and I confirmed this by checking the windows, all of which I had left in the same position I found them, closed, and none of which showed any sign of having been disturbed. The door had not blown shut. Something had closed it. I opened it and stood at the bottom of the back staircase and looked up. The staircase rises about 12 steps to the upper hall door, which was also closed. I could see the upper door clearly in the remaining light coming through the staircase window. As I stood there looking up at the upper door, the door handle moved. Slowly. The handle rotated downward, as if a hand on the other side was depressing it. It reached full depression and then released, slowly, rotating back to the neutral position. I stood at the bottom of the staircase for a moment. Then I walked up the 12 steps and opened the upper door and went into the upper hall. The upper hall was empty. Both bedroom doors were in the position I had left them, one open and one closed. The bathroom door was in the position I had left it, open. The hall was empty and silent. I went through every room in the upper floor. Empty. Nothing that could have moved the door handle. Nothing in any room that was not in the position I had left it, with the exception of a bedroom at the south end of the hall, where a small object, a glass drawer pull, that had been sitting on the windowsill when I came in that morning, was now on the floor directly below the windowsill. Not broken, sitting on the floor. It had not fallen from the vibration of the building or from a draft, because the window above it was closed and the building had not been subjected to any vibration in the hours I had been in it. I finished my work and I left the property before full dark. When I began the restoration work 2 weeks later, working from my documented plan, I was in the building daily. The first 3 weeks were without incident. The building was empty and the work was ordinary, and I did not have any repetition of the door handle or the glass pull. I started to think that whatever I had observed on the third assessment visit was an isolated incident, and that I had perhaps overstated my certainty about the door handle. Perhaps I had imagined the motion. The building was old and unfamiliar, and I had been working alone in diminishing light for several hours. I stopped thinking that on a Tuesday morning in the 5th week of the restoration. I was working in the primary bedroom on the upper floor, replastering a section of wall where water damage from a failed roof joint had caused significant deterioration. The work requires close attention and physical effort, and I was focused on what I was doing. I had my tools arranged on a drop cloth behind me and my materials staged against the opposite wall. The bedroom door was open to the hall. Something walked past the bedroom door. I heard it. Footsteps in the hall, deliberate and unhurried, from the south end of the hall, where the staircase was toward the north end where the second bedroom was. I turned from my work and looked at the doorway. The hall was empty. The footsteps had stopped at approximately the point where the north bedroom door was, though I could not see that far from where I was standing. I set down my tools and walked to the bedroom doorway and looked down the hall. The north bedroom door was closed. I had left it open. I walked to the north bedroom door and stood in front of it for a moment, and then I opened it. The room was empty. The window in the north bedroom was on the east wall, and the morning light was coming through it at an angle that showed the dust on the floor in clear relief. The dust on the floor showed footprints, not my footprints, which I could see at the threshold where I was standing. A second set of footprints, crossing the room from the doorway toward the window and stopping at the window, and not returning. I looked at those footprints for a long time. The shape of them was approximately human, barefoot, somewhat larger than my own. They crossed the room and stopped at the window, and there was nothing at the window, and nowhere the thing that made them could have gone except back across the floor, which the dust showed it had not done, or through the window, which was closed. I finished the Callaway restoration. It took 4 months of work, and I was in the building for most of that time. I heard footsteps in the hall on 7 additional occasions over those 4 months. I found 4 more instances of objects in positions different from where I had left them. Always small objects, always moved a short distance rather than dramatically displaced. On 2 occasions I heard what I can only describe as a voice, not words, not language, just the quality of vocalization from somewhere in the building when I knew I was alone in it, a sound in the frequency range of human speech, but without the structure of speech. I delivered the restored property to the family on schedule and within budget. The restoration is good work. The building is sound. I did not tell the family about the footprints or the door handles or the voice because there is nothing useful. I could have told them about any of it, and because the restoration they paid for was genuine and the building is what it appears to be, a well-maintained farmhouse in Yancey County with good bones and a new roof and updated systems. There is one thing I want to add that I have not told anyone because it is the hardest part to say plainly. On the last day I was in the Callaway farmhouse, the day I did my final walkthrough to confirm everything was in order. Before handing over the keys, I was in the north bedroom, the room with the footprints, doing my final check. I was standing at the window, looking out at the hollow and the hills when I felt something put its hand on my shoulder. Not firmly, not threateningly. The way you put your hand on someone's shoulder when you want to express something without words. A light, deliberate pressure for maybe 3 seconds. And then gone. I turned around and the room was empty and the dust on the floor showed nothing new. I was the only one in the room. I have been the only one in the room every time I have been in that room. Whatever made the footprints in the dust and closed the door and moved the glass pole and walked past the bedroom door in the hall. Whatever has been in that house for however long it has been there, put its hand on my shoulder on the last day I was in the building, and I do not know what that means, and I have been thinking about it every day for 3 years. I have restored 9 buildings since the Callaway property. I have not had another experience like it in any of them. I drive past the Callaway property occasionally, on my way to other jobs in Yancey County. It sits at the end of its hollow road, looking exactly like what it is, a restored 1880s farmhouse in good condition. From the outside, there is no indication of anything. I suppose that is true of a lot of places. The outside is rarely where the information is. Story 3, 17 years on a rural mail route in McDowell County, West Virginia, will teach you things about the roads you drive that no map and no GPS will tell you. You learn which roads flood first when it rains and which ones stay passable longest. You learn which dogs on which properties are genuinely dangerous and which ones make noise for theater. You learn the quality of the silence on different roads at different times of day, and you learn to notice when that quality changes, because on a route you have driven 5 days a week for 17 years, a change in the quality of the silence is information. My name is Colette Ferris, and I am 54 years old, and I retired from rural mail delivery 2 years ago after 17 years on the same route in McDowell County. I want to tell you that I loved that work. People underestimate what a mail carrier is in a rural community. You are often the only regular contact that isolated elderly residents have with the outside world. You notice when mail piles up and you make calls, you are a presence on roads that would otherwise see no traffic for days at a time. You know the people and the properties in a way that is intimate and earned over years. I loved that route and I was good at it, and I miss parts of it. The part I do not miss is what I'm going to tell you about, which began in my 12th year on the route and continued intermittently for the remaining 5 years until I retired. It involved a stretch of road in the upper end of my route, a dead-end county road that served 3 properties and terminated at a gate beyond which a former mining company had owned land that reverted to the county after the company dissolved. I drove that dead-end road 5 days a week. 3 deliveries, turn around at the gate, back out. I knew every foot of it. The road is about 1.5 miles long. It follows a narrow hollow, creek on one side, steep wooded hillside on the other, a single lane with occasional wide spots for passing. The 3 properties on it were spread along the first mile, and the final half mile to the gate was uninhabited, just road and creek and hillside, and the gate at the end. In my 12th year, in late autumn, I began to notice tracks on the road surface in the uninhabited section between the last property and the gate. Road surfaces in those hollows are often soft enough to hold impressions, especially after rain, and I was accustomed to seeing animal tracks on that section of road since it was rarely trafficked and wildlife used it freely. What I began seeing in that 12th year was not animal tracks in any configuration I recognized. I need to be specific about this because I have had conversations with people who want to assign a known animal to what I observed, and the assignment does not hold up against the specifics. The impressions were bipedal, alternating single file, left and right, the way human footprints are laid, rather than the paired or grouped configurations of quadruped tracks. The stride length was long, considerably longer than a human stride at walking pace, and the impressions themselves were deep, indicating substantial weight, and wide, wider at the front than at the back, which I noted specifically because it was consistently different from a human footprint's wider heel. I found these tracks on 6 separate occasions in that 12th year, always in the uninhabited section between the last property and the gate, always going toward the gate rather than away from it, which meant whatever made them was coming down the hollow from the gate end rather than going up from the inhabited section. I photographed several of them with my phone. I still have those photographs. I have shown them to 4 people and have gotten 4 different explanations, none of which account for all the specific features simultaneously. In my 13th year, the tracks appeared more frequently, and I began to notice something additional. On the days I found tracks, the road in the uninhabited section had a quality of silence that was distinct from its normal quality. Rural hollows have a baseline acoustic character that you learn over years of daily exposure. The sounds of the creek, the bird activity in the canopy, the small movements of wildlife in the brush. On the days the tracks were present, the bird activity in that section of road was absent, not reduced. Absent. The hollow in the uninhabited section was acoustically flat in the specific way that I had learned from years of outdoor work, to associate with the presence of something large enough to suppress the normal acoustic activity of the smaller creatures in the area. I drove that section of road knowing this. 5 days a week, I turned around at the gate and drove back out through a section of hollow that was sometimes just ordinary and sometimes acoustically flat in a way that told me something was there that was large enough to silence the birds. I did not stop in that section on the flat days. I made my turnaround at the gate and I came back through at a steady speed, and I did not stop. In my 14th year, I saw it. I want to tell you the circumstances of the seeing because they matter. It was a Wednesday in early March, overcast, the kind of flat gray light that reduces contrast and makes distances harder to judge. I had made my 3 deliveries and was driving the uninhabited section toward the gate. The hollow was acoustically flat. I knew before I saw anything that something was in the section with me. I was about 300 feet from the gate when I saw it on the hillside to my right above the road, in the bare, deciduous trees that covered the slope. It was moving in the trees, not through the trees, which would have involved the sounds of brush and branches. Moving in the trees, which is to say, it was above the ground and in the canopy, moving through the canopy in a way that involved contact with multiple branches and trunks, but in a fluid, controlled way, rather than the crashing disruption that any large animal in the canopy would produce. It was large. The canopy of mature, deciduous trees in March, before leaf out, gives you good visibility of what is in it. And what was in it was large enough that I could see its mass clearly against the gray sky through the bare branches. The mass was moving steadily toward the gate end of the hollow, above me and to my right, moving through the upper canopy at a pace that was approximately the pace of my vehicle on that road, approximately 40 feet up in the canopy, keeping pace with my truck. I drove to the gate. I made my turnaround. I drove back out of the section. I did not look at the hillside canopy on the way out. I made a specific decision not to look. I completed my route and I drove back to the post office, and I sat in the parking lot for 10 minutes before I went in to clock out. I told no one about this for the remainder of my time on the route. I drove the dead end 5 days a week for 3 more years, and I found tracks in the uninhabited section on 40 to 50 additional occasions, and I experienced the acoustic flat on a similar number of days. And I saw movement in the canopy 2 more times after the first, once in October that same year and once in February 2 years later, each time in the upper canopy, each time keeping approximate pace with my truck, each time I did not look on the way out. There is a thing I want to tell you about the logic of not looking on the way out that I have thought about a great deal. The decision to not look on the way out was instinctive, made without conscious deliberation, the same kind of instinctive decision that keeps you from looking directly at an eclipse. Something in me understood that the outbound trip, when whatever was in the canopy would be behind me and above me, and I would have to turn and look back and up to see it, was not the right time to look. That looking in that configuration communicated something that the driving without looking did not. I cannot tell you what it communicated. I can tell you that the instinct was consistent across 3 observations, and that nothing happened on any of those outbound drives, which I choose to interpret as confirmation that the instinct was correct. I retired at the end of my 17th year on the route. My replacement is a younger man who I trained for 2 weeks before I handed over the route. I showed him the roads and the properties and the specific quirks of each delivery point, all the things you accumulate over 17 years. I did not tell him about the uninhabited section of the dead-end road, or about the tracks, or about the canopy. I thought about it. I went back and forth on it for the 2 weeks I was training him. In the end, I did not tell him because I could not tell him what to do with the information. The information I have is that something large uses the uninhabited section of that hollow, and has been doing so for at least the 5 years I was aware of it, and probably much longer. The information I have is that something large moves through the canopy above the road in that section on certain days. The information I have is that none of my observations resulted in harm, and that my policy of not looking on the outbound drives seem to be the right policy. What I do not have is any understanding of what it is or what it wants or what the complete set of rules is for coexisting with it on that road. Without the complete rules, I could not give him useful guidance. Partial guidance felt more dangerous than no guidance. So I showed him where to turn around, and I showed him where the gate latch was, and I said the last property owner was an elderly woman who appreciated a knock on the door if the mail was heavy, and I left it at that. He has been running the route for 2 years. I do not know if he has found the tracks. I do not know if he has experienced the acoustic flat. I do not know if he has seen movement in the canopy. I think about this occasionally in the way that you think about something you left unfinished. Not with active guilt, but with a low, persistent awareness that there is a loose end you chose to leave loose. If he has seen what I have seen and has questions, I hope he finds a way to ask them. I would tell him the honest version. I would tell him about the tracks and the acoustic flat and the canopy and the policy of not looking on the way out. And I would tell him that the policy seemed to work and that the operative word is seemed, because I was never entirely certain, and certainty was not something that Hollow was ever going to give me. That is the truth of it. 17 years on a route that included a hollow that I was never entirely certain about. I drove it anyway. That is the job, and I loved the job, and the hollow was part of the job, and I made it 17 years without an incident that I could not drive away from, which in retrospect feels like something. Not safety exactly, more like the working result of a policy applied consistently over time in the absence of complete information, which is, when I think about it, how most of this work gets done. You do not always know what you are dealing with. You develop a policy and you apply it and you keep driving, and most days you make it to the end of the route. Most days. Story 4. I taught 7th and 8th grade science for 31 years in a small school district in Haywood County, North Carolina. My name is Orrin Puckett, and I'm 67 years old, and I retired 4 years ago, and I live on the same property I have lived on for the last 22 years. A 12-acre piece in a hollow outside of Canton that borders national forest land on its upper end. I chose the property partly because of the forest boundary. I like to hike and I like the access, and I've walked the trails on the national forest land behind my property many times over the 22 years I have been here. I want to tell you something about what 31 years of teaching science to 12 and 13-year-olds does to a person's relationship with the world. It reinforces, systematically and repeatedly, a habit of looking for causes. 7th graders want the world to be mysterious and strange, and part of your job is to teach them that the mystery and the strangeness are not reduced by understanding the cause. That understanding the cause is its own kind of remarkable. I believe that. I taught it for 31 years, and I believe it. What happens to you when you encounter something for which you cannot find the cause is a specific kind of discomfort that is different from ordinary fear, because ordinary fear usually has an object, and this does not. The discomfort of not finding the cause is the discomfort of the framework failing, and I've been in that discomfort since a morning hike on the forest land behind my property 18 months ago. I walk the same trail most mornings. It leaves my property at the upper fence line, crosses a small seasonal creek on a plank bridge I built myself about 15 years ago, and then follows a ridgeline north for about 2 miles before looping back down through a second hollow and returning to the property from the east side. The whole loop is about 4.5 miles, and I have walked it probably 800 times over 22 years. I know every feature of it, every blowdown, every wet section, every place where the trail is unclear and requires you to read the terrain to stay on it. 18 months ago, on a Tuesday morning in September, I was about 1.5 miles into the loop on the ridgeline section when I came around a long curve in the trail and stopped. There was something in the trail about 60 feet ahead of me. It was crouched in the trail, not sitting, crouching with the weight forward, the way an animal crouches when it is examining something on the ground. The shape of it was large, larger than a black bear, and the color of it was a dark grayish brown that blended with the trail surface and the surrounding forest in a way that made it difficult to read clearly. It had not detected me. It was crouched in the trail and attending to something in the trail's surface, a digging or examining motion with what I took to be its front limbs. I stopped completely and I stood still and I watched it. This is what you do when you encounter a large animal on a trail. You stop and you assess and you give the animal time to become aware of you in its own time. Because a surprise encounter at close range with a large animal that feels cornered is more dangerous than a calm encounter at distance. I know this. I stood still and I watched and I assessed. It was not a bear. The crouching posture was the first thing that told me this, because bears do not crouch in that configuration. The weight distribution was wrong for a bear, and the proportions of the visible body mass were wrong. The head was wrong. A bear's head at that distance in that light has a specific shape, a rounded, wide skull with small ears and a pronounced muzzle. And I know what it looks like because I have seen bears on and around my property over 22 years. The head of what was crouching in the trail was too long relative to its width, and sat on a neck that was longer than a bear's neck, and the ears, if they were ears, were positioned differently from a bear's ears. I stood still for about 2 minutes. The thing in the trail continued its examination of the trail's surface, unhurried, apparently entirely unaware of my presence 60 feet upwind. I considered making noise to alert it to my presence, which is the recommended protocol for bear encounters when the bear has not yet detected you. I did not make noise. Something stopped me from making noise that I did not examine at the time and have examined many times since. A gut-level instruction from somewhere in my nervous system that said, "Do not announce yourself to this thing." An instruction that arrived without explanation and that I followed without deliberating about it. After about 2 minutes, it stood up. It stood up from its crouching position, and it stood upright. And I want to be careful about this because upright can mean different things, and I want to be precise. It stood fully upright on 2 legs with its spine vertical, the way a person stands up. Not the partial rearing of a bear standing on its hind legs, which I've also seen and which has a specific look to it, a forward lean and a balance issue that bears have when they rear, because rearing is not their natural locomotion. This was different. It stood fully upright with the ease of something for which upright is the natural posture, and it stood at a height that I estimated then and have estimated many times since at between 8 and 9 feet. It stood upright, and it looked down the trail away from me, north in the direction the trail continued. It stood there for about 20 seconds with its back to me, and then it stepped off the trail to the right and walked into the forest, and within 4 or 5 steps, it was in the trees, and I could not see it anymore, and I could not hear it moving, which for something of that size was itself wrong. I stood where I was for what I estimate was 5 minutes. Then I walked forward to the spot where it had been crouching in the trail. There was a disturbance in the leaf litter on the trail's surface consistent with something having handled the material there, moved it, examined it. Not a scrape the way a bear makes when it is looking for grubs under the leaf surface. A more specific disturbance, as if the leaf litter had been turned over carefully and replaced in a different configuration. On the tree at the right side of the trail, the side it had stepped off into, there was a mark on the bark at a height of about 7.5 feet. A horizontal score in the bark, clean and deep, the width of what I estimated was a handspan. Fresh. The pale interior wood was visible. I turned around and walked back the way I'd come and went home. I have walked the loop trail many times in the 18 months since. I have not seen it again. I have found 3 additional bark scores on trees along the trail section, all at heights between 7 and 8 feet, all with the same horizontal orientation and the same fresh-cut quality when I first found them, though they have weathered since. The bark scores form a loose line along the ridgeline section of the trail, spaced irregularly over about half a mile. I have not been able to identify any tool or natural cause that produces that specific type of horizontal bark score at that specific height in that pattern. I taught biological science for 31 years. I have looked at those marks with the same methodical attention I brought to 31 years of teaching cause and effect to 12-year-olds. I do not have a cause for them. I do not have a cause for what I saw crouching in the trail and standing upright in my headlights, in the manner that only things with upright as their natural posture stand. I have the marks, and I have the observation, and I have the specific silence of something that large moving into a forest without any sound of its passage, and I do not have a cause for any of it. My students would find this exciting. The mystery without the explanation, the question without the answer, the framework failing to account for the evidence. I taught them for 31 years that this was the beginning of something, that the unanswered question was where science started. I believed that, and I still believe it. I also know that some questions are not looking for an answer in any science I know, and that standing in a trail in Haywood County, while something 8 or 9 feet tall stepped into the forest without making a sound, was not the beginning of an inquiry. It was the end of one. The end of 22 years of walking that trail and thinking I knew what was on it. I know better now. I walk it still. I walk it with better knowledge. I think that is the appropriate response to better knowledge, even when the knowledge is that you know less than you thought you did. Story 5. I ran a small sawmill operation in Leslie County, Kentucky for 18 years. Bandsaw, edger, 2 kilns, 8 to 12 employees depending on the season, primarily processing locally sourced hardwood for cabinet makers and flooring operations. I know timber and I know the people who work timber, and I want to say clearly that the men and women who work timber in eastern Kentucky hill country are not people who are easily rattled. The work is physically dangerous in ways that build a specific relationship with risk. You learn what real danger feels like, and you learn to respond to it practically. You do not have the luxury of being frightened by things that are not actually going to hurt you, because the things that are actually going to hurt you require all your available attention. My name is Grover Tackett, and I am 60 years old. And I sold the mill operation 6 years ago when my knees finally made the decision that I had been postponing for years. I live in Leslie County still, and I keep in touch with most of the people who worked for me. They were good workers and good people, and some of them are still my friends, and the account I'm about to give you was witnessed in its essential details by 2 of my employees, which matters because it means I am not asking you to take only my word for it. About 9 years into my operation, I was sourcing timber from a parcel of private land in the upper end of a hollow, about 6 miles from my mill. The landowner was a family I had a long relationship with. The land was good hardwood country, mostly white oak and poplar, with some cherry on the north faces. And I had been working that parcel in rotation for 4 years when the thing I'm about to describe happened. I sent a 2-man crew up to the parcel on a Tuesday in October to mark the next cutting section, which involved walking the parcel boundary and flagging the trees in the new section, a job that takes most of a day on foot. The 2 men I sent were a faller named Cletus Brock, who had been with me for 6 years, and a second man named Hayward Combs, who was in his 3rd season. Both experienced, both reliable, both the kind of workers who showed up on time and did the job right and did not make trouble. They came back to the mill at about 2 in the afternoon, which was 3 to 4 hours earlier than the job should have taken. Cletus came into the mill office first, and he sat down in the chair across from my desk, and he did not say anything for about a minute, which was unlike him. Cletus was not a quiet man. Hayward came in behind him and leaned against the door frame, and he looked like he had been running. I asked them what happened. What Cletus told me, with Hayward confirming the details from the door frame, was this. They had been about 3/4 through the boundary walk, in the northeast section of the parcel that bordered a steep ravine on the east side, when Hayward stopped and pointed into the ravine below the boundary line. The ravine was about 60 feet below them at that point, at the bottom of a steep, rocky slope, and it was heavily vegetated with the second growth that establishes in the bottom of ravines, where the canopy closes and moisture collects. Hayward had seen something in the ravine below, something large. He had seen it before he heard it, which was the first unusual thing, because something of the size he described moving through second growth vegetation should have been audible at 60 feet. He said he saw through a gap in the vegetation below a partial view of something moving through the ravine bottom, and that the partial view had been enough to stop him completely. Cletus looked where Hayward was pointing, and he also saw it, or the part of it that was visible through the vegetation gap. What both of them independently described, when I asked them to describe it separately, which I did deliberately, was a large shape moving through the ravine bottom that was too tall for the vegetation it was in, and that was moving upright on two legs at a pace that was deliberate and unhurried. The vegetation in the ravine bottom was dense second growth, chest high on a standing person, and what was moving through it was clearing the top of that vegetation with a body that extended substantially above it. Hayward said the top of it was visible at a height that the chest-high vegetation would put at 10 or 11 feet total height. Cletus said he thought Hayward was high on the estimate. He thought 8 or 9. They agreed that it was upright and that it was large, and that it was moving through the ravine bottom without any of the sound that something of that size moving through that vegetation should have made. Cletus said the silence of it was the thing that decided him. He put his hand on Hayward's arm, and they both backed away from the ravine edge, and then they came back through the parcel to the road, and they drove to the mill. I went up to the parcel the following day with Cletus, and we walked the northeast boundary section and went to the point where he and Hayward had been standing. I looked down into the ravine. The vegetation was exactly as they had described it, dense second growth, chest high. Along the ravine bottom, there was a channel pressed through the vegetation, a wide passage where the growth had been displaced, running roughly east to west through the ravine. The channel was wider than a deer trail and wider than a bear trail. It was pressed low rather than pushed through at standing height, which was inconsistent with the height Cletus and Hayward had described, but consistent with something that was crouching or moving differently in the bottom than it had been when they observed it. At the east end of the channel, where it reached a section of exposed rock at the base of the ravine wall, there were marks on the rock face, scratches horizontal, at a height of about 8 feet on the rock, multiple marks parallel as if made by something with more than one point of contact, like fingers, fresh enough that the rock dust was still at the base of the scratches. I closed that section of the parcel and rotated my cutting to a different section for the remainder of that contract. When the landowner asked why I was skipping the northeast section, I told him I wanted to let it rest another season. He accepted this without question. I did not tell him what Cletus and Hayward had seen or what I had found at the rock face. Hayward left the operation at the end of that season. He said he had found other work. Cletus stayed for 3 more years, and he and I never discussed the ravine after the day I walked the boundary with him. That was his way, and I respected it. Some things you see and you account for by not accounting for them out loud anymore. I sold the mill 6 years ago, and the new owner has continued to source from the same properties I used. I do not know if he has worked the northeast section of the Leslie County parcel. I do not know if the channel in the ravine is still there or has grown back in. I know that something moved through that ravine in October 9 years ago and left marks on a rock face at 8 feet and made no sound doing it, and that 2 reliable men saw it and came back 3 hours early and sat in my office without talking for a minute before they told me about it. I know that the marks on the rock face were real because I saw them myself. Beyond that, I do not know much, and I have learned to be comfortable with not knowing much. 18 years of running a sawmill in Leslie County, Kentucky will teach you a great deal about what you can control and what you cannot. And the thing in that ravine was in the second category, and I treated it accordingly. Story 6. I did archaeological field survey work in the southern Appalachians for 11 years as a staff archaeologist for a cultural resources management firm. This means I spent a significant portion of those 11 years walking terrain in western North Carolina and eastern Tennessee on formal survey projects, identifying and documenting sites of cultural and historical significance for clients who needed to understand the archaeological context of their properties before development or land management decisions were made. I have a graduate degree in archaeology, and I am trained to observe and document physical evidence carefully and to situate that evidence in its appropriate interpretive context. My name is Rowena Hatch, and I am 39 years old, and I left field survey work 3 years ago to take a position in collections management at a regional museum, which keeps me closer to home and off the mountain terrain that I worked in for 11 years and that I both love and have complicated feelings about since what I am going to describe. The account I'm going to give you involves a site I documented during a survey project in a remote section of a western North Carolina county that I am not going to name specifically, because the site is in a location that could be identified from the county and the terrain description, and I have reasons for not wanting the site identified. Those reasons are part of the account. I was doing a pedestrian survey of a large private parcel, walking systematic transects to identify any archaeological sites within the survey area. Standard method, standard pace, standard documentation. My field partner on this project was a man named Dale Withers, who has since left the firm and is now teaching at a university. Dale is a meticulous and conservative documenter, the kind of archaeologist who does not interpret beyond his evidence, and his character is relevant to the account because what we both observed and what he independently documented is consistent with what I am about to describe. The survey was in its third day when we encountered the site. We were walking a transect in the upper portion of the parcel, on a north-facing slope below a ridge, and the terrain in this section was heavily forested, old growth in places, with a dense understory that made transect walking slow. I was working the western transect line, and Dale was 50 meters east of me on the parallel line. We were in radio contact. I found the site by almost stepping into it. A depression in the ground surface, linear, running roughly north-south. That was not a natural topographic feature. I stopped and I looked at it, and I radioed Dale and told him I had a feature. He came to my transect line and we looked at it together. The depression was approximately 2 meters wide and 8 meters long, with defined edges that suggested either an excavated feature or the collapse of a below-ground structure. The kind of depression that forms over a wooden structure when the wood deteriorates and the ground above subsides. In an archaeological context, this is significant because it can indicate the location of a historic structure or a prehistoric earthwork. We flagged it and began systematic documentation. As we worked around the feature, I found a second depression about 4 meters north of the first. Same dimensions, same orientation, same defined edges. And then a third, 4 meters north of the second. 3 features in a linear arrangement, evenly spaced. Same dimensions, same orientation. This is the kind of pattern that indicates deliberate human construction rather than natural process. I was at this point excited in the professional way that a field archaeologist gets excited when a survey reveals something significant. I was documenting the third feature when I found the bone. It was on the surface, partially exposed by erosion at the north edge of the third depression. A single large bone, dense and dark with age, partially embedded in the soil. I crouched and examined it without touching it, which is the correct field protocol, and I called Dale over. We both looked at it together. The bone was large, very large, larger than any human bone, and larger than the comparable skeletal element of any animal I had a reference for in the regional fauna. It was consistent in general morphology with a long bone, a femur possibly, but the scale of it was wrong for any species I knew how to place in the southern Appalachian context. It was dense and well preserved and dark in the way that bone gets dark when it has been in the ground for a very long time. Dale and I looked at it for a while without speaking. Then Dale took photographs. Then I took measurements of what was visible without disturbing the soil. The exposed section of bone measured 68 centimeters in length and was not the complete element, meaning the complete element was longer. We finished the day's survey and we drove back to the project field station and we talked about the features and the bone over dinner, and we were both thinking about the same things and we both knew it. The features were deliberate and arranged, and the bone was real and anomalous in its scale, and we were going to have to decide what to do with what we had found in terms of the survey documentation. What we decided, and this is the part that I have the most difficulty with professionally and personally, is that we documented the 3 depressions as probable historic structural remains without further characterization, and we did not include the bone in our formal documentation. We did not include it because neither of us could place it in an interpretive context that would be supportable in a formal report, and because placing an anomalous large bone in a site report without context would require interpretive claims that neither of us was willing to make in a professional document. I have thought about this decision many times. It was not the right professional decision. The correct protocol was to document everything we observed and let the interpretive questions be handled at the appropriate stage of analysis. We did not do that. We made a field decision to exclude something that we could not explain, and that exclusion is in a formal report that a client relied on for land management decisions, and that is in a regulatory file in a state agency office. I am not going to tell you that the bone was evidence of something specific, because I do not know what it was evidence of. I'm going to tell you what I measured and what I observed. A long bone element, 68 centimeters of exposed length with additional length below the soil surface. Dense, well-preserved, dark with age. In a context that included 3 deliberately arranged depressions of a size and configuration that suggested constructed features of a non-natural origin. Those are the observations. The interpretation is something I do not have. What I want to add, because I said I would tell this completely, and I'm going to, is what happened the morning after we found the bone. We went back to the site the following morning to continue the survey. The bone was not where we had left it. The soil around the north edge of the 3rd depression was undisturbed. There was no indication of digging or extraction. The bone that we had both photographed and that I had measured at 68 centimeters of exposed length was simply not there. The soil around where it had been was unmarked. No tracks, no excavation, nothing that indicated how it had moved or where it had gone. I took photographs of the location where it had been. I have the photographs from the prior day showing the bone in situ, and I have the photographs from the following morning showing the unmarked soil where it had been. I have never shown these photographs to anyone except Dale. I have not submitted them anywhere. They are on a hard drive in my house, in a folder that I do not open very often. Dale and I finished the survey and submitted the report, and the project closed, and we both moved on to other projects. I left field survey work 3 years later, and Dale left the year after me. We have talked twice since we both left the firm. Neither conversation has included what we found on that north-facing slope. I do not think we are going to have that conversation. What we found is documented in the photographs and in our individual memories, and in the formal report in the way that it is not fully documented. And that is where it is going to stay. I work in collections now. I catalog and preserve objects that people have found and documented and donated to the museum's care. Every object in our collections has a provenance, a documented origin and context. I know where every object came from and what was known about where it was found and why that finding was significant. That documentation is the foundation of the object's meaning. The bone on that north-facing slope has no provenance. It has photographs and measurements and 2 professional witnesses and an absence. The absence it left in the soil the following morning and nothing else. It has no documentation in any official record. Whatever it was, it exists now only in the photographs on my hard drive, and in whatever portion of Dale's memory he has kept it in, and in whatever portion of mine I have kept it in, which is all of it. Every measurement, the color of it, the specific quality of the soil around it, the way it was not there the following morning, I'm a trained observer and I observed it carefully, and I documented it as well as I could given the decision Dale and I made about the formal report. That is the best I can offer. The site is on a north-facing slope in a county I'm not naming, and the 3 depressions are still there, and whatever was in the soil at the north edge of the 3rd one is somewhere else now. And I do not know where, and I have accepted that I'm not going to find out. That is what it means to work in a landscape that is older than your methods for understanding it. You find things that your methods cannot process, and you make decisions about those things in the field, and you live with those decisions. I am living with mine. Some days that is easier than others. Story 7. My professional title for the last 19 years has been Property Restoration Specialist, which is a term that covers a range of work, but in my case refers specifically to forensic cleaning and structural restoration of properties that have been damaged by fire, flood, prolonged vacancy, or what the industry terms traumatic events, which is the professional language for properties where someone has died, often in circumstances that leave the property in a condition that requires specialized remediation before it can be habitable again. I have worked in houses where people died alone and were not found for weeks. I have worked in houses that burned and left the structure standing, but the interior in a condition that most people could not look at directly. I have worked in condemned properties that had been closed for years and that had developed interior environments that required full protective equipment to enter safely. My name is Adele Crum, and I am 46 years old, and I am based out of Knoxville, Tennessee. I want to be clear about what my work has required of me over 19 years because it is relevant to the specific threshold at which I become frightened. That threshold is high. I have been frightened by specific structural hazards, by chemical environments, by biological conditions that posed real health risks. I have not, in 19 years of working in some of the most extreme interior environments that residential properties produce, been frightened by anything that I did not have a concrete material explanation for. Until a property in Cock County, Tennessee, that I was contracted to assess and remediate in the spring of 2 years ago. The property was a farmhouse, late 1800s construction, 2 stories, on about 8 acres in a rural section of Cock County. It had been vacant for 11 years following the death of its last occupant, an elderly man whose only heir was a nephew in another state, who had no use for the property and had finally decided to sell it. The 11 years of vacancy had produced the expected conditions. Roof damage leading to water intrusion, leading to mold growth in the upper floor and ceiling areas. Pest activity throughout. Deterioration of the mechanical systems. The usual accumulated consequence of a building that has been closed for 11 years without maintenance. I was contracted to do a full assessment first, then a remediation plan, then the actual remediation work. My assessment visit was on a Thursday morning in late April. A clear day, good light, conditions that I prefer for an initial walkthrough of a property in this condition, because good natural light tells you things about a structure that artificial light does not. I went through the ground floor first. The property was in the condition I expected from the documentation. Nothing outside the parameters of a neglected 11-year vacancy. I noted everything systematically in my assessment report and moved to the upper floor. The upper floor was worse than the ground floor, as expected given the roof damage. 2 of the 3 upper bedrooms had significant mold growth on the walls and ceiling, and the floor in both rooms had soft spots indicating water damage to the subfloor. I was in full protective equipment, respirator, and Tyvek, and I worked through both damaged bedrooms carefully, noting the extent of the damage and what the remediation would require. The 3rd upper bedroom was at the end of the hall. Its door was closed, which was different from the other rooms whose doors had been open. I noted this as I approached, not as anything significant, just as a detail. Closed doors in vacant properties are common. Someone closes them and leaves, and they stay closed. I tried the handle and the door was not locked, and it opened without difficulty. The room was cold. This was the thing I noticed immediately, and before anything else. not the relative coolness of a room that has been closed, which is a mild temperature differential that I have experienced in many properties. A cold that was immediate and substantial, a drop of what I estimated at the time as 15 to 20 degrees from the hall temperature, occurring at the threshold of the room. I stood in the doorway and felt the cold, and I looked at the room. The room was different from the other two damaged bedrooms in one specific way that I documented in my assessment notes, and that I have thought about many times since. The other two bedrooms had mold growth consistent with water intrusion from the damaged roof. This bedroom, which was in the same position relative to the roof and should have had similar or greater water damage, given its position at the far end of the upper hall, had no mold growth. None. The walls were clean, the ceiling was intact. The floor showed no soft spots when I tested it. The room was structurally and materially in better condition than any other room in the upper floor, despite having been closed for 11 years in a building with a damaged roof. I stood in the doorway for a moment, taking this in and doing the mental work of trying to account for it. Differential and roof damage directly above, possibly. Microclimate factors. Something about the room's position that directed water intrusion elsewhere. I was doing the professional accounting of the anomaly when I noticed something on the wall opposite the door. At approximately chest height on the wall opposite the doorway, there was a handprint. A single handprint, pressed flat against the plaster in what appeared to be a dark substance. I crossed the room and examined it closely. The substance was not paint, and was not mold, and was not any residue I could identify from the building's materials or history. The print itself was the size of an adult hand, but the proportions were wrong. The fingers were too long relative to the palm, substantially too long, and the spacing between the fingers was too wide, each finger separated from its neighbor by a gap that exceeded normal hand anatomy. I photographed the handprint. I documented it in my assessment notes. I finished my walkthrough of the property, which took another 40 minutes. When I left the property, I sat in my truck for a few minutes before I started the engine. In 19 years of forensic property work, I have seen handprints. People leave handprints in damaged properties in various substances, in various circumstances, and I have documented many of them. None of them have ever required me to sit in my truck before I could make myself drive. The proportions of the print on the wall of that cold room were wrong in a way that I could not account for with any normal explanation, and I have tried every normal explanation I know. I submitted my assessment report to the nephew's realtor the following week. I included the photograph of the handprint in the documentation with a note that it was an unidentified residue requiring further assessment. I did not include my notes about the cold or about the condition of the room relative to the other damaged rooms, because those were observational details that the remediation plan did not require, and that I did not know how to frame in professional language. I declined the remediation contract. I told the realtor that my schedule would not accommodate the timeline they needed. My schedule was fine. I recommended another contractor, and they took the job, and I have not followed up on the outcome. Some things you decline and move past and do not follow up on, and that is a professional boundary. I have learned to respect in myself over 19 years of work that most people cannot do at all. The handprint is still in my documentation files. I look at it occasionally. The fingers are too long and the spacing is too wide, and the cold in that room was real, and the room's condition relative to the rest of the building is not accountable by any differential in roof damage or microclimate factor that I can identify. That is what I have. I am a practical woman who works in extreme conditions, and I have no explanation for any of those three specific things, and I have accepted that I'm not going to find one. Story 8, wildfire recovery work is not glamorous, and it is not well understood by people who have not done it. What it involves in practical terms is going into burn zones after the fire has been contained and the immediate danger is past, and assessing the damage to the landscape and to any structures within the burn perimeter, documenting what has been lost and what has survived, and beginning the process of understanding what the land is going to need in order to recover. I worked in this field for 12 years, based out of a forestry consulting firm in Redding, California, and my work took me into burn zones throughout Northern California and occasionally into Southern Oregon and Nevada. My name is Albright Foss, and I'm 49 years old. I left wildfire recovery work 3 years ago for reasons that are partly physical and partly what I'm about to describe, and I now work in a different capacity for the same firm, doing GIS mapping and remote sensing analysis from an office rather than in the field. I miss the field work in the way that anyone misses work they were good at, and that meant something. I do not miss what happened in a burn zone in the Trinity National Forest in the summer 6 years ago, and I have not missed it once since. The fire that created the burn zone I am going to describe burned for about 3 weeks in late summer and consumed approximately 40,000 acres of mixed conifer forest in a remote section of the Trinity. It was a hot fire, which is the technical term for a fire that burns intensely enough to sterilize the soil and kill the seed bank, as opposed to a cooler fire that moves through more quickly and leaves the soil biology intact. Hot fires take longer to recover from, and they expose more of the underlying geology because they consume not just the standing timber, but the duff layer, the accumulated organic material on the forest floor that can be several inches deep in old-growth forest, and that, when it burns, reveals the soil and rock surface beneath it in a way that a cooler fire does not. I was in the burn zone doing post-fire assessment work about 6 weeks after the fire was contained. My crew consisted of myself and 2 other assessors, a man named Brent Caudle and a woman named Devin Yee, both experienced field workers. We were working a section of the burn zone in the upper drainage of a tributary of the Trinity River. Steep terrain, north-facing slopes, the kind of country that is difficult to move through even in normal conditions, and that in a burn zone presents additional hazards from unstable standing dead timber and erosion-prone slopes. The burn in this section had been extremely hot. The duff layer had burned completely, and the mineral soil below it was exposed for acres in every direction. In this kind of exposure, in old-growth forest that had been accumulating duff for centuries, you sometimes find things that the duff had been concealing. Stone features, old structural remnants, natural geological features that the accumulated organic material had buried over time. Finding things in the exposed soil of a hot burn is not unusual. It is one of the incidental aspects of post-fire survey work that I have always found professionally interesting. What we found in the exposed soil of the Trinity burn was not incidental. We were working a north-facing slope about 2 miles from the nearest road when Brent called out on the radio and told me to come to his position. His voice was neutral in the way that experienced field workers keep their voice neutral when they want to communicate something significant without communicating alarm over an open radio channel. I have used that neutral tone myself many times. I knew what it meant, and I moved to his position. He was standing at the edge of a shallow depression in the exposed mineral soil, about 30 meters across and roughly circular, that was lower than the surrounding ground surface by about half a meter. The depression had a defined edge, not the gradual slope of a natural topographic depression, but a distinct boundary that suggested the edge had been constructed or modified. Around the inner perimeter of the depression, at intervals of roughly 2 meters, there were stone placements. Upright stones, each about 60 to 80 centimeters tall, embedded in the soil of the depression edge, oriented consistently with their flat faces toward the interior of the depression. 14 of them that we counted, spaced at those regular intervals around the full perimeter. We looked at this for a while. I took photographs, Brent took measurements, Devin joined us and took her own photographs. We were all doing the same professional thing, which is observing and documenting before interpreting, giving yourself time to see what is actually there rather than what you expect to see. In the center of the depression, the mineral soil had a different character from the soil around it. It was darker, compressed, with a surface texture that was consistent with repeated contact over a long period rather than the loose mineral soil that the fire had exposed everywhere else. Something had been in that depression regularly and repeatedly for long enough to affect the character of the soil's surface. At the center of the compressed area, there was a marking, scratched into the mineral soil, not etched in stone, scratched into the earth itself, a circular pattern about a meter in diameter, with radiating lines extending outward from the center. The scratches were deep and clean in a way that was inconsistent with the fire having burned over them, which suggested they had been made after the fire in the exposed soil, recently enough that the burn had not affected them. After the fire, someone or something had come into the burn zone after the fire and made those marks in the center of the depression. We documented everything. We measured and photographed and noted coordinates. Then, we continued our assessment work and did not discuss what we had found until we were back at the base camp that evening. At base camp, I called my project manager and described the features. He listened and asked several clarifying questions and told me he would contact the appropriate parties regarding the stone feature, which in Northern California burn zone work can involve tribal historic preservation offices and other regulatory bodies. This is a normal part of the process, and I expected it. What I did not expect was what Brent told me that evening after the call. He had not included it in his field notes and had not mentioned it during the documentation process, because he had not been certain enough of what he had seen to document it as an observation rather than a perceptual artifact of a long day in difficult terrain. He said that when he first came to the depression, before he called me on the radio, he had stood at the edge for a moment taking it in. And at that moment, from the forested area uphill from the depression, from the section of the burn zone that backed up to unburned timber on the ridge, he had heard something. A sound that he described as rhythmic and low, not mechanical, not animal in any category he could place. Sustained for about 20 seconds and then stopping. He had looked toward the ridge and had not seen anything. By the time I arrived, the sound had been absent for long enough that he had not mentioned it. I asked him why he was telling me now, and he said, because he had been thinking about the marks in the center of the depression, the ones scratched into the soil after the fire. And he said that the rhythm of the sound he had heard was similar to what you would produce if you were making those marks in the soil with something hard. The rhythm of making marks. He said he could not be certain of that, and he was not putting it in his notes, but he wanted me to know he had heard it. I drove back to the site alone 2 days later, on a rest day, not officially, not as part of the survey work. I drove to the nearest road access and hiked the 2 miles back to the depression. The site looked exactly as we had documented it. The stone placements, the compressed center, the marks in the soil. I stood at the edge of the depression for a while. Then I noticed something I had not noticed during the original documentation, and that I cannot account for by any explanation of memory or perception that I have found satisfying. The stone placements. The 14 upright stones spaced around the inner perimeter of the depression. On my initial visit, I had counted 14 of them and had documented them as such. Standing at the edge of the depression on my second visit, I counted again and arrived at a different number. 15. I counted 3 times. 15 stones. I checked my photographs from the original documentation on my phone, the photographs I had taken myself. I went through every photograph of the perimeter systematically. 14 stones visible in the documentation. I left the site and drove back to Redding, and I did not go back to the depression again. I documented the discrepancy in my personal notes and nowhere else. I submitted my survey documentation, and the project moved through its regulatory channels, and I have no information about what official determination was made about the stone feature. The project is closed, and the documentation is in a regulatory file somewhere, and the depression is in a burn zone in the Trinity National Forest, and there are now 15 stones around its perimeter instead of the 14 that were there when the fire exposed it. One stone, the difference of one stone. That is what I cannot put down. Not the depression or the marks in the soil or what Brent heard. The single additional stone that appeared between my first and second visit to the site. The choice to add one stone, the precision of that. Whatever put it there added one stone to a circle of 14, making 15, and did it between one documented visit and one undocumented return visit by a single field worker on his day off. Whatever was in the unburned timber above that depression on the ridge knew someone had been there and knew someone had come back. And it made an addition to the site between those two visits that was small enough to require careful attention to detect and large enough to be unambiguous once detected. One stone. I think about the precision of that more than anything else. Whatever it was precise. Story 9. We have had the store in Bland County, Virginia for 3 generations. My grandfather built it in 1951. My father ran it from 1973 until he passed, and I have been running it since 2001. It is a general store in the old sense, which means it sells a little of everything and is as much a community gathering place as it is a retail operation. People come in for groceries and hardware and feed, and they stay to talk. And the talking is as much the point as the purchasing. I know everyone in this community by their first name, and I know most of their family histories, and I have been known by them my whole life. My name is Harriet Kales, and I am 58 years old, and what I am going to describe is something I have known about for most of my adult life, and that I have never discussed publicly, because discussing it publicly felt like a betrayal of something I did not have a complete understanding of. I'm discussing it now because I am 58 years old and I have decided that there is more value in the account being known than in my continued discretion about it. And because 3 people who knew about it with me have all passed in the last 4 years, and I'm the only one left who carries the complete version of it. The store sits on a county road at the edge of the community. Behind the store there's a storage building, then a field that my family has owned but never actively farmed, about 3 acres of rough grass that backs up to a woodlot, and then the woodlot itself, which runs up a gentle slope to a ridge. The ridge is the county line. The land on the other side of the ridge belongs to an old family that does not interact much with the community, and that has owned their property for about the same length of time my family has owned ours. My grandmother, who ran the store with my grandfather from 1951 until he died in 1977, told me something when I was about 30 years old that she had not told me before. She said she had been meaning to tell me since my father passed, but had not found the right moment. She told me that the woodlot behind the store had always had something in it that came out at night and came to the edge of the field. She said my grandfather had known about it, and had known about it when he built the store, because the family he bought the land from had told him when he purchased it. She said it was a condition of the sale, not a legal condition, an informal one. The family selling the land told my grandfather that something used the woodlot and came to the field at night, and that they had always left it alone, and that leaving it alone was the appropriate response, and that the store being there would not be a problem as long as the field was not developed and the woodlot was not cleared. My grandfather accepted these terms without knowing specifically what he was accepting them about, my grandmother said, because the price was right and the land was good, and because he was a practical man who understood that rural land came with histories that were not always fully disclosed, and that the appropriate response to inherited conditions was usually to respect them until you had a reason to do otherwise. For 26 years of running the store together, my grandmother said, she and my grandfather had respected the condition. They did not go into the woodlot at night. They did not develop the field. They did not install lighting on the back of the store that would have illuminated the field. The one time my grandfather had gone into the woodlot in the late evening, not at night, but in the late evening in winter when dark came early, he had heard something moving in the trees at a distance, and he had come back to the store immediately and had not gone into the woodlot after 4 in the afternoon for the rest of the time they owned the property. She told me she had seen it once. She did not tell me this lightly. She was a woman who chose her words carefully and who did not say things she was not certain of. She said it was a summer night, and she was awake late doing the store accounts, and she had gone to the back door for air, and she had looked out at the field in the moonlight, and something was at the far edge of the field, at the woodlot boundary, standing upright and still. She could not see it clearly at that distance in that light. She could see the shape of something upright and large against the darker tree line behind it. She stood at the back door and looked at it, and it stood at the woodlot edge, and she did not know if it was looking back at her or not. After a few minutes, she went inside and closed the door and went to bed. She said that was the only time she saw it directly in 26 years. She said she believed it had been there many other nights, and that she had simply not been at the back door at the right time. She said my grandfather believed the same. She said the important thing, the thing she was telling me because she needed me to know it as the person who would be running the store going forward, was that the condition was still operative, and that I should continue to respect it. The field should stay as it was. The woodlot should stay as it was. No backlighting, no development. Leave it alone, and it would leave us alone. And that was the arrangement that had worked for 50 years, and she saw no reason to change it. I have run the store for 22 years since my grandmother told me that, and I have respected the condition in every particular. The field is rough grass. The woodlot is intact. There is no backlighting on the store. I have not gone into the woodlot after 4 in the afternoon in any season. I have seen the shape at the woodlot edge twice in 22 years. Once in the late fall of my 3rd year running the store, and once about 6 years ago in midsummer. Both times I was at the back door late at night, and both times it was the same experience my grandmother described. A shape at the woodlot boundary, upright still against the darker background of the trees. Both times I stood in the doorway and looked at it, and after a few minutes went inside. Both times nothing else happened. I do not know what it is. My grandmother did not know what it was. My grandfather did not know. The family that sold the land to my grandfather did not tell him what it was, only that it was there and that the appropriate response was to leave it alone. That information has been passed down through 4 transactions of this land, from whoever had it before the selling family, to the selling family, to my grandfather, to my grandmother, to me, and at no point in that chain has anyone been able to say what it is, only that it is there and has been there, and that leaving it alone is the correct response. I am 58 years old, and I have no children, and the store will probably pass out of my family when I'm gone. Someone else will own it, and they will not know about the condition because I am the last person who carries it. This account is my attempt to put the condition somewhere that is not entirely lost, because whatever is in that woodlot has been part of an arrangement for at least 70 years, and probably much longer, and I think it deserves to have someone on the human end of the arrangement who knows the terms, even if that someone is not someone I will ever meet. The field is rough grass. The woodlot is intact. No backlighting. Leave it alone, and it will leave you alone. That is the condition. That is what I have honored for 22 years. That is what I am putting here, so it exists somewhere outside my own keeping. Story 10. I have a graduate degree in geology from the University of Tennessee, and I spent 14 years doing geological field survey work in the Ridge and Valley province of eastern Tennessee and the adjacent sections of the Appalachian Plateau before I moved into academic teaching, which is what I do now. Survey geology requires the kind of close attention to the physical character of terrain that most people do not develop because most people do not have the professional necessity to develop it. You learn to read rock faces and soil profiles and topographic features the way other people read text. The information is there in the physical record, and your job is to extract it accurately and situate it in its appropriate interpretive context. My name is Delvin Prater, and I'm 52 years old, and I'm an associate professor of geology at a university in Tennessee that I'm not going to name, because what I'm about to describe involves a site that I have not reported through official channels, and that is located on land where my presence at the time of the survey was not formally authorized. The land access question has since been resolved, but the site has still not been formally reported, and the reasons for that are part of the account. About 7 years ago, I was doing field survey work on a private parcel in Cumberland County, Tennessee, assessing the geological character of a karst terrain section for a client who is interested in understanding the cave system potential of the property before making land use decisions. Karst terrain in eastern Tennessee is karst terrain in the sense that it is underlain by soluble limestone that has been dissolved by groundwater over millions of years to produce cave systems, sinkholes, and surface drainage features that are characteristic of the geology. Finding cave systems in karst terrain is not unusual. What you are looking for in a survey like this is the scale and character of the system, its connectivity, its hydrological behavior, and any features of archaeological or environmental significance within it. I found the cave entrance on the third day of the survey, which was not a surprise given the terrain character. The entrance was in a north-facing hollow, partially obscured by vegetation, a horizontal opening in the limestone face about 1.5 meters high and 2 meters wide, with the characteristic cold airflow that indicates a connected system rather than a simple shelter cave. I documented the entrance, and on the following day, I went in to do a preliminary interior assessment. I was not equipped for deep cave exploration. I had appropriate lighting and a rope for the entrance section, but I was not equipped for the kind of extended exploration that a complex system requires. My intention was to assess the first section of the cave, document the basic character of the passage, and determine whether the system warranted a more formal exploration effort. The entrance passage sloped down at a moderate angle for about 30 meters before leveling into a horizontal section that was approximately 3 meters high and 4 meters wide. Good dimensions, good airflow, the passage continuing into the dark beyond my light range. The floor of the horizontal section was predominantly breakdown, limestone blocks that had fallen from the ceiling over time, with areas of flowstone and areas of fine sediment in the lower zones between the breakdown blocks. In the fine sediment between the breakdown blocks, there were tracks. I have been in caves throughout the Tennessee karst system, over 14 years of survey work, and I know the tracks that are made in cave sediment by the animals that use caves. Raccoons use cave entrances and leave distinctive tracks. Cave crickets and other invertebrates leave no tracks meaningful to my scale of observation. Cave salamanders and bats leave no tracks in the sediment. What I was looking at in the fine sediment between the breakdown blocks was not consistent with any of those animals. The tracks were bipedal, alternating impressions in the fine sediment left and right, arranged in a walking pattern. The impression shape was elongated, wider at the front than the back, with what appeared to be toe impressions at the front, 4 of them visible in the cleaner prints, arranged in a fan configuration. The stride length was approximately 1 meter. The depth of the impressions indicated substantial weight relative to the sediment surface. The prints went in one direction, deeper into the cave, away from the entrance. I followed the prints for about 40 meters into the horizontal passage. The passage maintained its dimensions, and the airflow was consistent throughout, indicating the system continued beyond my light range. The prints continued in the same direction for the full 40 meters I followed them, always deeper into the cave, always the same stride pattern, always away from the entrance. I did not continue past 40 meters. I was not equipped for further penetration, and I was alone, which is a condition that I knew even in that moment was not the correct condition for the depth of cave I was in. I documented the prints photographically and with measurements, and I made my way back out to the entrance. Sitting at the entrance in the afternoon light, I looked at the photographs on my camera and I looked at the information they contained, and I sat with the interpretation problem that the information presented. Bipedal tracks in fine cave sediment going deeper into a cave system of a scale and character that I could not attribute to any animal I knew to use cave environments. The prints went deeper into the cave, and they did not come back out. I had documented 40 meters of a passage that continued beyond my light range, and the prints went in one direction the entire length of what I documented. Whatever made them had gone in and had not come back out the way it went in, which meant either it had exited through another connection to the surface, or it was still in the system. I am a geologist, and I know that cave systems in karst terrain are connected in ways that are not always visible from the surface, and that animals using cave systems often have multiple entry and exit points. I know the rational framework for what I found. The rational framework does not fully account for the scale of the impressions or the stride length or the four-toed configuration or the weight they indicated. I did not include the tracks in my survey report to the client. I documented the cave entrance and the character of the entrance passage and the basic dimensions and airflow characteristics, and I recommended a formal cave survey by a qualified team with appropriate equipment. I did not mention what I had found in the sediment. I have not formally reported the tracks to any scientific or regulatory body. The reason I have not reported them is the same reason I have not reported other anomalous finds in my 14 years of field survey work, which is that a formal report requires an interpretive claim, and I do not have an interpretive claim for bipedal tracks in fine cave sediment at a scale and stride length that exceeds any known cave-dwelling species. I can document, I cannot interpret, and a find without an interpretation is a professional liability that most academic geologists are not equipped to manage. I have the photographs. They are in an archive on a hard drive in my office at the university. They are labeled with the location coordinates and the date and nothing else. They are the most anomalous thing I have documented in 14 years of field survey work, and they are labeled with coordinates and a date and nothing else, and they will probably stay that way. What I will tell you, as the last thing I want to include in this account, is something I have thought about in the years since that survey. Cave systems in karst terrain are among the most stable environments on the surface of the Earth. The conditions inside them change very slowly. The temperature is constant. The humidity is constant. The sediment accumulates slowly and preserves impressions for very long periods. A track in fine cave sediment can survive for decades or centuries if the sediment is not disturbed. The tracks I documented were fresh. The impression edges were sharp and clean in the way that impressions are sharp and clean when they have been made recently rather than aged by the slow processes that gradually soften the edges of older impressions. Whatever made those tracks in the horizontal passage of that Cumberland County cave had been in the cave recently. Not decades ago, not centuries ago, recently before I was there. It went deeper into the cave and the passage continued beyond my light range, and I was alone, and I was not equipped for what was beyond my light range, and I turned around and went back to the entrance. That was the correct decision. I have not second-guessed it. What I have second-guessed is not reporting what I found, because if something bipedal and of that scale is using that cave system, it is using it in a way that my survey documented evidence of, and that evidence is on a hard drive in my office, labeled with coordinates and a date and nothing else. I do not know what the correct next step is with that evidence. I do not have colleagues I can bring it to without consequences for my professional standing that I am not prepared to manage. I have an anomalous documented find and no path to reporting it that does not create problems I am not equipped to navigate. So it sits on the hard drive, and the cave is in Cumberland County, and the passage goes deeper than my light reached, and whatever went in did not come out the way it went in. And I teach geology to undergraduates 4 days a week, and I know that the Earth contains things that our current frameworks cannot account for. And I teach my students that the framework failing is where the real work begins. I just have not found a way to begin that work with the photographs on my hard drive. Not yet. Maybe not ever. That is the honest answer, and I am giving you the honest answer because the alternative is to give you something that sounds better than the truth, and I have been giving people something that sounds better than the truth about this for 7 years, and I am tired of it.